Committee. And I better get this title right. I think it's the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. Well, that's taken the first 5 minutes of our time. But you're certainly welcome, Secretary of State. Thank you very much for coming to be with us. Thank you. Let's move on then to look at another really big issue the committee's spent a lot of time on in the last few years for obvious reasons, and that's building safety. Florence Shalomi.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Secretary of State, to your new role, and I hope that this is an area that you will give enough foresight and look at some of the issues that if were honest, your predecessors stalled. You'll know that there's been unacceptable delays in the surveying and remediation of buildings with fire safety defects. So we are sat here now almost, 4.5 years after Grenfell. Does your department now have the complete data on A, the number of buildings with non-ACM cladding, and B, the number of buildings with 18 metres, under 18 metres, requiring that remediation?
I think we have a very good picture, but not a perfect one. And I'd say two things in connection with that. The first is that I've had the opportunity to meet some of the survivors of the tragedy, some of those who were obviously bereaved, and relatives next of kin and others within the community. And what happened, this committee needs no reminding, was just absolutely horrific. And as the inquiry has shown, there are a number of related elements that have struck me at the time, and have really struck me with force since I come into the department to look at. So, I think it's impossible to look at the whole question of cladding without asking a series of prior questions. Who were the developers who allowed this material to be used? Who were the people who sold it to them, knowing that there was a potentially catastrophic risk involved? Why was it the case that individuals were prepared to think that they were acting legally when we now know manifestly that they weren't? And so I think, A, you're absolutely right, there is an urgent need to deal with the persistence of ACM cladding on tall buildings, but I also think that there is an equally urgent need to ensure that justice is done. So the government has a responsibility to make buildings safe, but we also have a responsibility to relieve some of the obligations that are being faced by leaseholders at the moment, who are innocent parties in this, and who are being, in many circumstances, asked to pay disproportionate sums when there are individuals in business, some of them still in business, who are guilty men and women.
And that's reassuring, and I'm sure many leaseholders up and down the country from all our different respective constituencies will be pleased to hear that reassurance from you, but I think it's important that we see some action. Just on the basis, coming back to the issue on the data then, if that's something that you could be provided to the committee.
Yes, absolutely. No. My view is that there shouldn't be any barrier to total transparency on data on buildings we've identified, work undertaken, who has had access to the BSF money, and so on. Again, it's a incredibly complicated set of issues, because as we know, registered social landlords, housing associations will want to make sure that those living in their homes are safe, but if they shoulder the burden of, as has been well advertised, of this work, then that means that their capacity to provide new housing is limited as well. So what I'm trying to do is not to stall any of the progress that has been made, but just to ask again about some of the levels of support that we're giving and where some of the responsibility lies. And again, it seems to me that an insufficient level of responsibility is being shouldered by those who were most responsible for getting us into this terrible situation in the first place.
No, we're all agreed on that. So one of the things in terms of looking at the nightmare that leaseholders are facing is around what is deemed a risk. So on this committee, we've called for a comprehensive building safety fund that moves away from that risk in terms of height and products used, which again are very important, but actually we have something that deals with the fire safety defects.
Yes.
What would you say to those proposals?
Well, again, I wouldn't dismiss them out of hand, but what I'm trying to do is to look at the different levels of risk. So, again, as we know, by definition, if you have a tall building, if you have cladding which acts as a conduit for or conductor of fire, which means that you have a catastrophic risk as a result, that is a terrible thing. Terrible thing. And action needs to be taken. It is the case that, and I'm trying to assess this, with smaller buildings which have other fire risks, those fire risks are not negligible, but the question has to be asked, what is the best way of mitigating them? You know, in the whole principle of limiting fire risk was to ensure, theoretically, that if a fire broke out in one part of a building or a dwelling, it could be contained. Manifestly, cladding, far from playing a part in containing, it generates it exaggerates and increases the risk for everyone else. Part of the question in my mind is, when we're looking at containment elsewhere, what steps, what interventions do we need to do in order to reduce the risk overall? And so, you know, I've asked for that information because I just want to be certain that we're using our money as wisely as possible, and that people can have reassurance that the homes in which they live are safe, and then those who want to move on, who are leaseholders, have the reassurance of knowing that they can participate again in the housing market.
And just on that, you find that so many leaseholders can't.
Yes.
Even though your department's made clear that the EWS1 form should not be required for buildings under 18 metres. And this was back in July.
Yes.
But up and down the country again, we are seeing lenders refusing to lend, people being unable to remortgage, people trapped, including people who need, you know, treatment for terminally ill diseases in terms of cancer.
Yes.
They are all trapped, not being able to move. People want to start families. And it's a case of no urgent action seems to be happening yet. What additional measures will you be putting in place to make sure that we see some movement in that and people are not trapped with ends on site and see no end to this nightmare?
No, I will completely sympathise, and I think that it comes back to a fair assessment of risk and then rapid action to deal with it, and the right people paying or being ultimately held accountable. So we collectively, you know, the department, some in local government, others in the private sector, failed people at Grenfell. And there are people who were and still are in buildings where there's a significant risk in reducing it. But it's also the case that there are some buildings where the real level of risk is less than had been feared. But for the reasons that you outline, the assessment that has been made of what is required in order to provide reassurance to lenders is such that leaseholders face, to my mind, an excessive burden. So part of this process is being clear about what is high risk, clear about what is lower risk, clear about who should pay in order to deal with the higher risk buildings, and clear also about what we can do in order to minimise risk in the lower risk buildings without creating a situation whereby people can't move and cannot access mortgage finance. And it's inevitably a delicate process, and one that I'm coming to with, as much as possible, a fresh pair of eyes. We mustn't hang around in dealing with it. But I also think that we need to recognise that while lots of steps have been taken by people with the very, very best of intentions, we've got to a situation where we're simultaneously not dealing fast enough with some of the big issues. We're not getting the a right response from some in the private sector, and then there are leaseholders in particular who are being unfairly penalised.
And just back on that same point, and again, appreciate the urgency that you want to deal with this. So lenders, to my understanding, lenders are still waiting for the department's expert panel to withdraw that consolidation advice note.
Yes.
Can we have a timetable or clear indication of when that advice will be out to the market?
Well, again, I want to do that before Christmas because we know that the Building Safety Bill will be having its report stage ideally before then. And as I say, there are a number of interrelated issues. And I think that everyone concerned with this question is owed from me and from the department an explanation or an account of how each of the interconnected parts of this terrible situation are going to be addressed. And so if we're saying through new advice that the risk is less than we feared in some particular areas, then people need to know, okay, and are you actually dealing with those which are truly risky in an appropriately urgent way? And are you really relieving individuals who don't have to spend the amounts that you've been talking about of that burden and so on? So there's a connected set of issues, but you're of course right that the quicker that we can provide clarity in all of them, the better.
I think that would be the best Christmas present for a number of people who do not require that EWS form on their building, so that they can move on. Just lastly, Secretary of State, one of the other areas, big areas, is around wake and watch.
Yes.
And your predecessor again highlighted that exorbitant fees faced by residents, and it's essentially rip-off. Do you agree with this statement, Secretary of State?
Yes, but it's not the only rip-off in the system. So I think it has been the case that one of the dreadful things is it's not just the case that there were people who before Grenfell were cutting corners and putting people's lives at risk. It's now the case that you have other people who, in the wake of the tragedy, are saying, in order to be safe, you need this or that, and to do the other. And that is also, I think, unfair on people who, by definition, are either in social housing or in private housing, who are not people with enormous resources. So, yes, he was right. But it goes beyond that. And
will anything be done on that? So we're talking in excess. I represent an inner London constituency, Vauxhall. People are paying over £5,000 a month.
Yes.
For wake and watch schemes.
Yes, and as I say, lots of people made decisions in good faith in order to try to make sure that we learnt the lessons. But I think that there have been some individuals and organisations that, instead of making themselves part of the solution, have seen an opportunity to make money for themselves, and we just need to look at it all in the round to try to deal with that.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Boris. Carrying on with the issue of building safety, Mary Robinson. Mary.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, lots of people made decisions in good faith to get their properties.
Yes.
So I'd like to look at the remediation and the cost of it. Your predecessor stated that the introduction of a 15-year period for claims under the Defective Premises Act would deal with the lion's share of outstanding issues in multi-occupancy blocks. Do you think that's right?
I've asked to review that, and I think on the basis of the fact that the types of issues that resulted in the situation in Grenfell happened as a result of cladding being applied and interventions being made in that period, meant that I think that as a snapshot overall judgment, I completely understand why that position is the inherited one. I just want to satisfy myself that it's right. So it's not that I instinctively disagree with it or think there's anything wrong. It's just that a decision that seems to me to be commonsensical, that was taken in good faith by a very, very good Secretary of State. I just want to be absolutely certain myself that I've looked at the small print and can agree.
And will we see some data to back up?
Yes, no, I think the whole point again is just, again, building on Florence's point. I think that if you're talking about what is safe and what is not safe, and if you're talking about why you're not extending liability beyond a certain number of years, I think people want to see that data so they can understand why the decision was taken, the basis on which it was taken.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier, a lot of people affected are not people with enormous resources. The government's now only protecting leaseholders from unaffordable remediation costs. Why should leaseholders have to pay for a crisis that they didn't create?
Well, that's one of the first things I asked. I don't believe that they should. So, leaseholder, as a general rule, as a leaseholder, you accept that you have a responsibility at certain points to pay for repair. But I felt two things before coming to the bottom. One, putting the building safety issue in Grenfell to one side, I felt that the balance between freeholders and leaseholders was wrong, and that leaseholders were often stung through service charges and other charges unfairly. Not by every freeholder, but in particular here, some people have said to me, it's a case of caveat emptor. And I think that's rubbish. I think that people bought these flats and houses these flats in good faith. Now suddenly they're being landed with charges which are, in many cases, grotesquely disproportionate and out of all proportion to, their ability to pay. And there are other players in the system who bear a greater share of responsibility. So that's my starting point. Now, I have been told, as I imagine this committee has been told, that it is that you can't just give freeholders the responsibility to pay for it, and B, that some of the ultimate ownership of some of these properties is extremely hard to discern, and that C, that the developers and others who may have been responsible in the first place for these decisions may have done this work through special purpose vehicles. They may have done this work through corporate structures that are deliberately opaque. That might all be true, but to say, well, that's all too hard. We're not going to do that. The easy people to sting are the leaseholders, I think, is wrong. Now, it may well be that I have to come back to this committee or back to the House of Commons and say, look, I've tried my very, very best and I've failed, but I just don't think as a starting point that we should be asking people who, exactly as you say, Mary, through no fault of their own, have been landed with these bills to pay the bills on the scale that's been envisaged.
Thank you, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that, as I'm sure people watching will be too. The committee's April report also highlighted issues raised by leaseholders who are attempting to access the Building Safety Fund because measures are being put in place. Specifically concerns about funds not being accessible until funding was in place for all non-cladding remediation works to take place. The Minister said that this wasn't the case, and the committee recommended that the fund agreement be updated to make that clear. What are you doing to ensure that applicants aren't prevented from accessing the fund because of funding issues for these other non-cladding related remedial works?
Well, I've specifically asked the very good team who are dealing with building safety and the administration of the Building Safety Fund to look at precisely this issue. And as I mentioned to Florence, and as this committee knows, there are an interconnected set of issues. So if you're going to fix how access to Building Safety Fund works, and at the same time, you're also saying, actually, we want leaseholders to face significantly less of a burden. We also want taxpayers collectively to face less of a burden. Now, there are ways in which we can do that, and I've talked to some of the leaseholder groups and so on about what we can do, but what I want to do is to try to come back with as coherent a package as possible, rather than in a piecemeal way, saying I'm dealing with this aspect or that aspect. As I say, it might be that any changes that I come up with are inadequate and don't meet the need, but that's my starting point.
Of course, the issues around this have affected a lot of people in these premises, and particularly with regards to the 18 metres.
Yes.
In calling for proportionality, your predecessor claimed that following expert advice, the government now believes that the number of buildings requiring remediation under 18 metres is likely to be very small. Are you satisfied with this approach and that it represents the best way forward? Or are you concerned it may leave some buildings still unsafe?
Well, I think that he's, again, building on the conversation with Florence, I think that is broadly right, but I want to be absolutely certain. So people can say, oh, you're drawing a line arbitrarily because of height and so on, but the key thing is, as I understand it, is there a building where there is a catastrophic risk because it's been built or indeed changed, enhanced, it would have been thought of in the past, in such a way as to essentially encase it in petrol, absolutely unacceptable, get rid of it all. Or is it the case that you have a building where there is, yes, a risk, but that risk is one that you can better mitigate through other means, making sure that compartmentalisation is done appropriately, making sure that the fire and rescue service know how to deal with these events and so on. And I think that the overall point, which Dame Judith made and which Robert articulated, is we just need to have that proper, scientifically and rigorously based assessment of what is really ultra risky and other risks that are lesser but not negligible.
Thank you. I think a lot of people will be looking forward to hearing more about this. Thank you.
Okay, Bob Black.
Yeah, can I just take you up, Secretary, on two issues in relation to this? First is that your predecessors haven't been able to answer this, so I hope we can make some progress.
Yes.
Namely, the developers will say, well, we built in line with building regulations as they were. We tested our products according to the tests that the department had used for fire safety, and we're all completely in accordance with that. Yet the products are not safe. The buildings were not put up properly, but someone signed them off to say they were acceptable by either at local level or by a company at a regional level. So we have a problem here that people will say, well, this wasn't down to us. It was the regulations at the time, which is a reasonable argument to say if the regulations have changed or been modernised as a result of Grenfell, then the government is changing the goalposts.
Yes.
So why should the developers then have to pay for it? Why shouldn't the government be stumping up the cash to make sure that now the regulations have improved and the fire safety issues have improved, that everything is put right as it should have been? Clearly, I think we all accept the principle that the leaseholders should not have to pay anything.
Yes.
But the key then is who is responsible for actually the problem in the first place?
Well, I cannot claim to have perfect knowledge of the issues that have been raised so far in the inquiry. But insofar as I've looked at it, it would seem to me that developers and construction product manufacturers, if they say that they are squeaky clean, are wrong. What we've seen so far from the inquiry, it would seem to me, and obviously we have to be careful about various legal questions, is that at the very least, developers have to ask whether or not they were engaging in, quotes, value engineering, in other words, seeking to reduce costs in a way which, not just with the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, people would have known was putting cost reduction ahead of safety. It's also the case we know that while, if I were defending the construction product industry, I would say it's not that a product is intrinsically unsafe, it's how you use it. Nevertheless, what the inquiry has uncovered are examples of tests of the safety of a product in particular circumstances being manipulated, it would appear, in order to evade responsibility. And we have one particular company which is hiding behind the law of its own country in an unprecedented way to avoid answering questions here. So just on the basis of the evidence that's laid out, and if I'm wrong, I'd be more than happy to apologise, but it seems to me that there is a direct responsibility on companies that still exist where mistakes were made. Now, on top of that, I also think it was the case that the system of assessing compliance with building regulations and the responsibilities placed on local government meant that they were not discharged effectively. I'm not criticising any particular local authority, but it was the case that, in effect, the deregulation of assessment and the way in which it was done was mistaken. And I also think, and this will be very, very painful, that the department itself, as the inquiry turns its attention to the department's role, will be seen to have, on a couple of occasions, not necessarily appreciated the importance of fire safety and not necessarily done everything in the wake of the Lacanal House tragedy that it should have done. So in stressing the role and responsibility of those in the private sector, I'm not for a moment saying that central government or local government doesn't have responsibilities. But I think the basic point, which is, oh, that was all fine, now you've changed the rules, so you must pay. No. You can look back and see what was happening at the time, and you can say, okay, the sheriff or sheriffs might not have been on the ball, but the cowboys were behaving like cowboys in an unregulated way.
So one of the issues here is that we were told in the going through the fire safety bill, that the place to do this and correct this was in the building safety bill.
Yes.
Now, my understanding of the progress in committee is that it's we're not getting amendments to the bill, which do get back to the polluter actually paying the cost.
Yes.
And so, are you now looking at what we can do to that bill to make sure that it's fit for purpose, given the comments you've made already?
Yes.
Excellent. So the second issue I just want to pick up on very briefly is the forced loan scheme, which my colleague has been referring to. As I mentioned during the budget debate, we were promised this, about the details of this, some 18 months ago.
Yes.
We were promised that it would be revealed at the time of the budget. It hasn't been. And we now have leaseholders who, as Florence was describing, are sitting there, not able to sell their flats, not able to insure them, not able to get a mortgage, and being told that they're going to have to pay the cost of this.
Yes.
And at the same time, a government commitment that there will be this loan scheme, which no one seems to know how it's going to operate, which will be revealed. And in the meantime, nothing seems to be moving. So where are we?
Well, no, quite. Well, but again, I think that the loan scheme, others thought that a grant scheme might be more appropriate, was a perfectly rational way of addressing the issue. But I think that for the reasons that we've just discussed, I wanted to take a couple of steps back and say, okay, I can see why, given everything else, we would think this was the right idea. Can we just pause and see if this is a necessary way of dealing with it? Because I'm still unhappy with the principle of leaseholders having to pay it all, no matter how effective a scheme might be in capping their costs or not hitting them too hard at any one time. My product question is, why do they have to pay at all? And now, as I say, it may be that I come back to the House and this committee and say, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried, but I fear, for the following reasons, it's too difficult. But I'd want to be able to explain why we couldn't achieve exactly, as you point out, a polluter pays approach.
Just following that, make sure we're clear. So I think it's very welcome what you said today, Secretary of State, and we look forward to your view on matters once you had the further look at them. So in terms of leaseholders not having to pay, Is your intention that should apply to non-cladding fire safety issues as well as cladding issues?
Well, this is at the heart of it, because going back to my earlier point, I think that in ordinary circumstances, a leaseholder will find themselves paying for the repair and upkeep of their building. It seems to me that there are leaseholders who have been hit with massive sums of money in order to deal with the cladding issues, and in some cases other remediation issues. If it is the case that other remediation or fire safety issues don't need to have the cost or be done in the same way as those in the catastrophic areas, you can perhaps reduce the obligations overall. But what I want to do is to be able to make a judgment about A, how we can get resource from elsewhere, and then B, make a judgment about what might be a fair de minimis or other rule for what leaseholders may have to pay. But against that's against the backdrop of my own belief that we need to reform the leasehold system overall because of its unfairnesses.
Yes. So I think your intention then is to look at all these costs, including non-cladding costs.
Yes.
Because for many people, they can be bigger than the cladding costs.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful. And on the Leaseholder Committee did a lot of work on this.
Yes.
And I'm sure we stand ready to help with pre-legislative scrutiny if that's how the government chooses to pursue this in the future. Just in terms of the polluter pays, residential property tax is welcome. So you're having discussions with the Chancellor about maybe that should be an addition to the £5 billion in the Building Safety Fund rather than a contribution towards it?
The Chancellor decides all these things in his wisdom, and then we just follow on.
I'm sure his wisdom can be assisted in these matters. Let's move on to another important issue that's happened during COVID, and that's the issue of homelessness and evictions. Ian Byrne.
Thanks, Chair. And just as someone that served on the Building Safety Bill Committee over the last 3 months, the direction of travel you're moving here is very welcome. And to echo what Bob said, we look forward to the report today, Secretary of State. And it's been very interesting hour listening to what you've been saying after sitting in that Bill Committee for 3 months, worried about what was actually getting said in that Bill Committee.